At just 17 years old, Jonathan Antoine walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage carrying far more than microphone. He was carrying years of bullying, damaged confidence, and a fear that people would judge him before they ever heard him sing. Then he opened his mouth, and everything changed. But behind that unforgettable performance was a much darker story. Jonathan later revealed just how low he had been before BGT, and why that audition meant far more than winning a talent show. Before millions knew his name, Jonathan was simply a teenager trying to find his place. He had struggled with his weight for years, and the comments from other people had slowly damaged his confidence. In an interview around his BGT audition, he explained that words from others had taken pieces of his confidence away. Getting onto a stage was already difficult for him. And then there was Charlotte Giaconelli. The two teenagers had become friends at school, and Charlotte was more than just his singing partner. Jonathan said he did not think he would have gone onto the BGT stage without her beside him. She gave him the courage he was missing. That detail makes their first audition even more powerful. When Jonathan and Charlotte appeared in front of Simon Cowell, nobody knew what was about to happen. Cowell even questioned whether Charlotte was the right partner for Jonathan. But Jonathan refused to abandon the friend who had helped him find his confidence. Then came the music. Their performance of The Prayer stunned the room. Simon Cowell, who had looked doubtful moments earlier, suddenly saw something completely different. He called Jonathan unbelievable and told him he was a future star. For Jonathan, however, the biggest victory was not Simon's reaction. It was proving to himself that he could stand in front of millions of people and be heard. And what happened after that performance would change his life forever. What would you have done if you were Jonathan? Follow your own path or stay with a friend who gave you the confidence to begin? Let me know in the comments. But the audition was only the beginning. Jonathan and Charlotte were about to become one of the biggest stories of that BGT season. And the next few months would take them somewhere neither teenager could have imagined. The audition had changed everything. Jonathan Antoine and Charlotte Giaconelli had gone from two teenagers to national stars almost overnight. They finished second on Britain's Got Talent in 2012, but losing the final did not end their story. In fact, the real journey was only beginning. After the show, Simon Cowell's Psycho label signed the duo. Their first album, Together, arrived later that year and reached number 5 on the UK album chart. For Jonathan, this was almost impossible to believe. Not long before, he had struggled to even imagine a future for himself. Now, his voice was being heard by people around the world. But fame came with a strange problem. Jonathan was still only 17. Suddenly, he was performing on television, recording music, traveling, meeting famous people, and living a life that most teenagers could barely imagine. The pressure was enormous. Yet instead of disappearing after BGT, Jonathan and Charlotte kept moving forward. Their second album, Perhaps Love, was released in 2013. It contained songs that allowed both singers to show more of their individual voices. And that detail would soon become very important, because behind the scenes, something was changing. Jonathan and Charlotte had started BGT together. Their friendship had helped Jonathan find the courage to perform. But now both young singers were growing, and each had different musical goals. Then, in 2014, the partnership came to an end. Sony Classical offered them separate solo record deals, and Jonathan decided to take the next step on his own. It was not simply a dramatic breakup or a secret feud. The two were moving toward individual careers. For Jonathan, that meant facing something he had never faced before. He had to stand on a stage without Charlotte beside him. Would audiences still want to hear him alone? That question mattered because Charlotte had been part of the story from the very beginning. Together, they had become famous. Now Jonathan had to prove that he could build a career with nothing but his own voice. And surprisingly, he did not just survive. He exploded onto the classical music scene. His first solo album, Tenore, was released in October 2014. ITV described him as a teenage Pavarotti, and the album became a major success, reaching the top of the UK classical chart. Jonathan was only 19. The boy who once struggled to believe in himself was now performing internationally. He even appeared at the iTunes Festival as a guest of legendary tenor Placido Domingo and performed in the United States. But there was still something the public could not see. Jonathan had become successful, He had become famous. Yet the emotional battles that existed before BGT did not simply disappear, because the cameras did, and years later, Jonathan would reveal just how serious those struggles had really been. Before we get to that difficult chapter, make sure you stay with this story, because Jonathan's biggest transformation was not his career. It was the transformation of the person behind the voice. TF for many people, Jonathan Antoine seemed to disappear after his incredible BGT success. But the truth is very different. Jonathan did not stop making music. He simply moved away from the television spotlight and began building a career on his own terms. His first solo album, Tenore, was released in 2014 and reached #1 on the UK Classical Albums chart. He was only 19 years old, and suddenly, the teenager who had once needed Charlotte beside him was standing alone. He was invited to perform at the iTunes Festival as a guest of the legendary tenor Placido Domingo. He also performed in the United States and appeared at the Muhammad Ali Celebrity Fight Night. This was not the career of someone who had vanished. It was a career of someone slowly moving into a different world. Then came Believe in 2016. Once again, Jonathan reached #1 on the UK classical chart. His music was now mixing famous classical pieces with musical theater and modern songs. He was no longer simply the big guy from BGT. He was becoming Jonathan Antoine, the solo artist. But there was a deeper change happening. Jonathan was growing older, gaining more control over his music, and learning what kind of artist he wanted to become. He was not trying to recreate that first BGT moment forever. And that decision mattered, because reality TV fame can disappear very quickly. One year, millions of people know your name. A few years later, the same people may wonder where you went. Jonathan chose a different path. Instead of constantly chasing television appearances, he continued recording and performing. In 2020, he released Going the Distance, an album built around the idea of overcoming adversity and following your dreams. Then came another important chapter. In 2024, Jonathan released by request the Diane Warren Songbook Volume 1, working with famous songwriter Diane Warren. And in 2026, his musical journey continued with his 5th solo album, Speaking to You. So if you only remember Jonathan from that emotional BGT audition, you might have thought his story ended there. It didn't. But there is still one question. Why did someone with such a powerful voice become so much less visible to the mainstream audience? The answer is not simply that he lost fame. It is that the entertainment world moved on, and Jonathan had to decide whether he wanted to chase it or build something more personal. And his next chapter will reveal just how far he had come from the frightened teenager who first walked onto that BGT stage. For years, people who remembered Jonathan Antoine from Britain's Got Talent could easily have wondered, where did he go? But Jonathan was never really gone. He was still singing, still recording, still performing. And in 2026, he is proving that his story is still moving forward. His latest album, Speaking to You, was released on March 27th, 2026. The album has 12 songs and includes everything from All of Me and Bang Bang to The Sound of Silence and Impossible Dream. But the title of the album says something important about Jonathan's journey. Speaking to You. It sounds almost like a message to the people who have followed him since that nervous teenager first appeared on BGT. Jonathan's official website describes this period as a new era in which he feels more comfortable with himself, both personally and creatively. His music is now focused not only on showing what his voice can do, but on creating an emotional connection with the people listening. And that may be the biggest change of all. The Jonathan we saw in 2012 was trying to prove that he belonged. The Jonathan of today seems much more interested in simply being himself. His journey has also moved beyond music. His official biography says he has spoken openly about self-worth, mental health, and anti-bullying, issues that have remained personally important to him. He has also worked on children's books and other creative projects. That is a very different picture from the idea that he simply disappeared after BGT. In fact, his career has continued for more than a decade. He released Tenore in 2014, Believe in 2016, Going the Distance in 2020, Christmas Land, and later by request, the Diane Warren Songbook Volume 1. Then came Speaking to You in 2026, and he is still performing live. His official website lists a September 11th, 2026 performance at St. James's Church, Piccadilly, in London. So perhaps the real story is not what happened to Jonathan Antoine. Perhaps the better question is, what happened to the boy who once thought he could not fit in? And how did he become a man who no longer needs to? Many people watching this may know what it feels like to be judged too quickly. Maybe you've been told you were not good enough, not talented enough, or simply different. Jonathan's story shows something powerful. Sometimes the person who looks like an outsider at the beginning is the person who has the most unique story to tell. And Jonathan's story is not finished yet. But there's still one part we haven't fully explored. The biggest question surrounding his BGT years. What really happened to Jonathan after the fame, the pressure, and the sudden changes in his life? That answer brings us back to the beginning and reveals why his journey means so much more than one unforgettable audition. For a long time, the public saw Jonathan Antoine as a teenager with a huge voice who had appeared on Britain's Got Talent. But there was a story behind that voice that many viewers never knew. In 2026, Jonathan spoke again about how serious his struggles had been before BGT. He revealed that years of bullying and depression had left him in a very dark place, and that he had even made plans to end his life. He described the opportunity to audition for BGT as arriving at exactly the moment he needed something to give him hope. That changes the way we look at his famous audition. It was not simply a talented teenager trying to win a competition. For Jonathan, singing became a reason to keep going. He has described music as his superpower and said that singing gave him purpose. And perhaps that is why his story did not end when the television cameras stopped following him. After BGT, Jonathan and Charlotte became recording artists. Their album together reached number 5 in the UK. Then, in 2014, they separated professionally and began their solo careers. Jonathan could have been trapped forever by the label of BGT contestant. Instead, he built a second career. He released Tenore, then Believe, then Going the Distance. He worked on projects connected to Diane Warren and continued performing for audiences around the world. His music career kept developing even when mainstream television was no longer showing him every week. And his story changed in another important way. Jonathan became more open about mental health, self-worth, and bullying. He also publicly discussed his autism diagnosis and his ongoing experience with depression. This is where his story becomes bigger than music. Because millions of people know what it feels like to be judged by appearance, treated differently or told, directly or indirectly, that they do not belong. Jonathan knows that feeling personally. Yet the same teenager who once struggled to believe in himself eventually stood on some of the world's biggest stages. His physical appearance also changed dramatically. In 2020, he revealed that he had lost 4 stone, explaining that the decision was about becoming healthier for himself rather than pressure from the music industry. And today, he is still creating music. His 2026 album Speaking to You shows that Jonathan is continuing to move forward rather than simply living in the memory of his BGT fame. Apple Music lists the album as a 12-song release from March 27, 2026. That is the real answer to the question, what happened to Jonathan Antoine? He did not disappear. He grew up. He changed. He struggled. He found his voice, not just as a singer, but as a person. And maybe the greatest part of his story is that the young man who once needed a friend beside him to walk onto the BGT stage eventually learned that he could stand on his own. If you've ever felt like an outsider, Jonathan's journey carries a simple message. One painful chapter does not have to become the ending of your story. The boy who almost lost hope became a singer who gave hope to other people. And that may be Jonathan Antoine's greatest success of all. But this story is also a reminder that fame does not always follow the path we expect. Some stars stay everywhere. Others quietly build something deeper away from the spotlight. And if you want to discover what happened to another unforgettable BGT star after the cameras stopped rolling, the next story may surprise you even more.